Hello everyone, my name is Anitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the Digimon card game's sealed format rules. So for those who are unfamiliar with what the sealed format is in a general sense, it's basically where you're handed a whole bunch of packs and then you basically build a deck with the cards that you pull from within those packs. This is different than a draft format, where draft format you basically take the same type of concept, except you're passing the packs around and picking one card from each pack. But regardless, it's really nice to see that Digimon does have sealed format rules, so let's just go over what those rules exactly are. We have Experience the Fun of Sealed Format. So in sealed format, players each open a set number of booster packs from specified sets and build their decks with only the cards that they open. Unlike standard play, you can ignore colors when you're digivolving your cards, and there are special rules for deck building. So what this basically means is you get to ignore color restrictions when digivolving your cards. This is really important because you're not going to be able to build cohesively in a sealed format just because the amount of cards and what cards you're working with is limited. So they had to do a little bit of loosening on some of the core rules of the game, and this is one of the rules that they felt like they could loosen, so that way you could still play the game as much as you possibly can, while still trying to get the core experience of what the Digimon card game is about, while still offering something unique and fun on the side. Next, we have the suggested packs to use, and they say that 6 packs is the suggested amount of packs to use because that goes into deck construction rules, where after you open your 6 packs, players will build a 40-card deck and a deck of Digi-Eggs between 0 and 5. And then there are no banned or restricted cards, while in the sealed format, and players can include as many copies of a card with the same name and number as they like, as long as they open them. So any leftover cards from your constructed deck are treated as sideboard cards. So the reason why that they suggest to use 6 packs is because that way, between 6 packs and building a 40-card deck with 0 to 5 Digi-Eggs, you should reasonably be able to at least build something relatively decent and have at least a large enough card pool to actually make deck building decisions. So in the Digimon trading card game, a single pack is going to have 12 cards. So if we do 6 times 12, well, you could just do the math. And that is 72 cards that we have to work with for our pool of cards to build a deck with. Then the suggested match format is going to be to use a Swiss draw format to match players with the closest win rates. So this just means by the end of the event, you should have the strongest decks playing against each other or the strongest players playing against each other, which is just normal for most card games. And then as far as sideboards are concerned, cards not used in your deck are treated as sideboard cards. In between games, players can exchange cards in their sideboard with their main deck. And then players can exchange as many cards in between them as they like, as long as you just have a legal deck by the end of it. So this is just pretty standard sideboard stuff, and then you get to keep all the cards from all of the packs that you open. So your usual sealed format rules here. And then under the game's special rules, in sealed formats, players can ignore Digivolution color requirements. So you still have to keep in mind their cost, and you still have to keep in mind their level. It just means that you don't need to worry about their color in order to Digivolve. So like I mentioned before, you could basically Digivolve a red level 3 into a blue level 4. Ordinarily, you wouldn't be able to do that currently in the card game, but in sealed formats, you can. And on top of that, colors can only be ignored when it comes to standard Digivolutions. So you do have to keep in mind color requirements on text for cards for options, and whenever a card is referring to a specific color, then that still applies as well. So if you want to use a red option, then you are going to need to have a red Digimon in play, or if a card specifically targets a particular color, let's just say purple, so a card is targeting a purple card, then you need to actually have a purple card for it to target. So they do have their own examples in the document, but basically this is just the game trying to be as normal as it possibly can while bending just enough to allow some good flexibility for the sealed format. And all this just kind of makes sense because you can't reasonably expect to make a very cohesive deck with just 72 cards to work with out of your packs. Now, when it actually comes to deck construction, this is going to be probably the easiest / hardest part all at the same time, just because you are going to be very limited in your options on how you could actually build your deck and what cards that you actually can reasonably think about utilizing, let alone what cards are going to be good paired up with all of your other cards. So when it comes to building a sealed deck, the most important thing you have to keep in mind of is actually the card's rarity, because we are going to see a higher number of commons, uncommons, and rares than we are going to see of secrets and supers. So even though there is a lot of power in the secrets and supers, we can't reasonably think about those cards because we have a lot lower chance of pulling those cards, let alone the cards that we want to use, let alone cards that are actually going to be synergizing with what they want or what they need. So when it comes to basic deck construction, you always just need to think about your win con. So most of the time in the Digimon card game, your win con is going to be coming from your level 6s. So if we just look at the commons, uncommons, and rares, and we just look at what level 6s we have to work with, we could see that these are the basically win conditions that most of the colors are going to be working with. And then in this set, we also do have a rare level 7, so there is a good chance that you could see a Chaosmon pop up in your sealed pool. Now, when it comes to looking at your win condition, you just actually have to identify what realistically is a better win condition than some other cards. So something like a Dark Germon isn't necessarily the best win condition because you can't really utilize his on-play ability that efficiently to make the card really, really powerful. There still is that possibility where you can, all depending on your pulls, but realistically you could just expect this ability not to trigger, and you're just going to be looking at the card literally for his raw stats. So he's not necessarily the best type of win condition, but something more generic like a Spinomon is, because he doesn't really require much of anything to be good outside of his own ability, and his own ability doesn't need anything else to make him good. So some of the better megas that you could think about utilizing, all depending on what you pull, is going to be Spinomon, Victory Greymon, Zed Garurumon, Regulicusmon, Varodurumon, Lotusmon, Bancho Leomon, Bancho Golemon, Anubismon, and Chaosmon are all really good examples of very generic and very standard win conditions that really don't need much synergy to make them as powerful and effective as they possibly can be. Now, when it comes to building a deck, you also have to look at your synergies. So one of the good synergies that's going to be in the set is the Digiburst ability. So the fact that we have so many cards that have Digiburst and can interact with Digiburst, that it's really interesting to think about utilizing these cards in some really powerful and meaningful ways. So as a good example, Budmon is probably going to be one of the better Digitamas to pull in the set if you have some good complementary cards to utilize its ability with. So even though this might not seem like it's going to be doing too much, if you're actually able to utilize the card, then it's going to be really good, and something as generic as the Digiburst mechanic in the set is going to be a lot easier to utilize than a lot of the other synergies that we have. So we could see that with the Digiburst ability, we also have a slew of these Digimon where when they're used with the Digiburst ability, then we get to add them back to our hand. So each of the colors have one of these, so if you're able to actually build a Digiburst deck, then that's going to be really, really interesting, because you could be like, okay, I'm going to play Budmon, then I'm going to Digivolve Budmon into Gaomon, and then you could figure out a way to cap off into something like Victory Greymon. And then you could utilize the fact that Victory Greymon has his own Digiburst to just interact with the fact that you're playing Digiburst, and because Digiburst can span across multiple colors, there's just a whole bunch of different things that you could do with just cards saying Digiburst. And it definitely makes for one of the easier types of supports and synergies to utilize within the set. But even if you're unable to utilize supporting cards in a meaningful way, that still doesn't necessarily make them bad, just because, again, this is a limited environment that we're talking about, and you can't necessarily control what you're going to see. So if you see something like a Digimon, yes, while he is one of the more unusable Digitamas in the set, because we could utilize him just as a generic Digitama, he still has value because you could still draw a card off of him, even though you most likely won't be able to get his ability off. So even though you would prefer to play something like Bukamon or see something like a Bukamon where you could at least make use of the ability sometimes, it's still not a bad thing just to have Digitamas in, even though there's no synergy, just because that they still can act as a Digitama, which means you could still use them as a starting point to start drawing cards. So in terms of being able to build a deck ratio, deck ratios are really important just because that's just how the deck is going to flow overall. So making sure that your deck ratios are always going to be super important whenever you're going to be constructing your deck. Obviously, because you can't necessarily control what you're going to be pulling, sometimes you can't exactly hit these ratios, but this is generally a really good preferred ratio that you should think about utilizing, which is going to be 10 level 3s, 8 level 4s, 6 level 5s, 4 level 6s, and 2 of whatever you feel like you want to use. But again, this isn't necessarily the exact way you should be going about building your deck. It's just a recommended deck based on percentages and ratios. Again, most of the time, you're still going to want to prefer and prioritize playing Digimon over anything else, just because that is what is going to help you win the game. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that options aren't good or can't be good. A lot of these options are very good, but most of the time, these options are going to be a little bit on the harder side to utilize, just because a lot of the time, these options are more specifically geared towards something. So the more generic option cards that you would want to utilize are going to be the removal cards, just because that's impacting the board in a very powerful and meaningful way, and usually those require a lot less of an investment versus something else. So the best removal options that we have to think about utilizing is going to be Trident Revolver, Aqua Viper, Full Moon Blaster, and Hell's Gate. So those are definitely the option cards you want to prioritize utilizing over any of the others, just because the others could be very hard to utilize properly because you don't necessarily have the proper deck to utilize those cards. Not saying something like Beast Cyclone isn't necessarily super great, it's just compared to a lot of the other options that we would rather prefer to run, or other Digimon we would prefer to run, it's just something I wouldn't necessarily prioritize playing. But again, if you are able to manage and build a really powerful and interesting deck that has some really good synergies, something like a Pollen Spray actually could be very useful, just because, again, the Digiburst mechanic spreads between a whole bunch of different colors, so something like this definitely could see a lot more usability just based on the types of synergies and cards that you're able to pull. But again, if you're not really able to pull it, then this card definitely isn't something you should prioritize putting into your deck. Even if you have like 1 or 2 targets, I still wouldn't prefer to run this card, just because I could play something a little bit more consistent and something that'll definitely be more meaningful or impactful for the deck overall. On top of which, we do have to keep in mind that we do need to have a card on the field in order to utilize the option cards properly. So if you don't necessarily have enough blue cards in your deck, then even playing something like Full Moon Blaster isn't necessarily super conducive, just because you might not be able to utilize it just because your Digimon lineup isn't able to support it. So that's why option cards generally should take the biggest backseat when building your deck, and you only really should think about utilizing the more generically good ones that could best synergize and fit well with your deck. And then Tamers are going to be in a very similar situation to what option cards are, except Tamers have a little bit more generic usability overall. So even though you might not be able to utilize all of them as efficiently as you could be, they still have some very powerful and very meaningful effects, all depending on what you're trying to gain out of the card. So even if you can't, let's just say, utilize Thomas's main ability because it interacts with Gauss, he's still an on-play draw card, and that could still be relatively decent and giving you access to a blue card on the field. So there's just a whole bunch of different things to think about when figuring out what tamers you want to be utilizing, but obviously the better tamers are the ones that have more generically good abilities that really don't require anything else to be super good. So the best tamers to think about utilizing are going to be Tai, Izzy, and Kari, just because they are the more generic tamers that require the least amount of investment. But I wouldn't necessarily rely on you trying to utilize a tamer just because you might not even see a tamer, or you might think about playing better or more meaningful, impactful cards for the overall deck, all depending on what your pool is going to be looking like. So we know that all of the tamers are at least the rare rarity, so that means that at worst case scenario in your pool, you could pull a maximum of 12 rares, and out of those 12 rares, if you see any tamers, then don't feel inclined to just automatically slap it into your deck, especially if it doesn't fit or if it doesn't work. But that's why I would generally like to prefer to play more Digimon than I would Tamers and Options, just because Digimon overall are going to be easier to play and are going to be the most impactful cards that you could be playing, because they could be utilized in various different ways, all depending on what your sealed pool is going to be looking like. But at the end of the day, the whole point of a limited and sealed format is to just have fun and experiment and play around with the new cards. So even though there is a really big luck factor because it is luck dependent on what you pull, there's still a decent amount of skill in deck building and playing the actual game that could help mitigate some of that bad luck on your pulls. But like I said before, at the end of the day, what's really important is you just having fun. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are different ways that you could support me in the channel. So one of those ways is I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so whenever you use that affiliate link to buy cards off of tcgplayer.com, then some of the money will go to supporting me in the channel. And on top of which, I also do stream over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu. So following and subbing is a good way to support me over on that platform as well. And on top of that, I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook. So whenever you buy one of my designs through them, then some of that money will also help go to supporting me in the channel. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.